It is mid-morning at Hampton Court Palace in the early autumn of 1539, and the doors of the presence chamber swing open on their great iron hinges, and the King of England walks through them. He wears cloth of gold over crimson velvet, slashed at the sleeves to show a lining the colour of a fresh bruise turning gold, and the weight of it on his shoulders would stagger a smaller man, though he carries it the way he carries everything, as though the fabric had been poured onto him rather than sewn. A chain of gold and rubies crosses his chest twice. His bonnet is white, plumed, and tilted with a carelessness that took his gentleman the better part of an hour to arrange. Every man in the room bows low enough to lose sight of the king's face for a moment, and when they rise again, he has already crossed halfway to the canopy of estate at the far end, moving with a rolling, deliberate gait that the court has learned to call stately and never once, in his hearing, calls anything else. The light comes in long bars through the tall windows and catches the gold thread in his doublet, so that he seems, for the length of a held breath, to be made of the same substance as the crown that will never quite leave his household even when it is not on his head. Ambassadors watch him from the edges of the room with the particular attention of men whose next dispatch home will depend on what they observe in his colour, his temper, the ease or stiffness of his walk. Courtiers watch him the way sailors watch weather. He laughs at something said to him by a gentleman at his elbow, and the laugh rolls out across the hall, and 40 people exhale at once, because a king who laughs in the morning is a king who will likely be tolerable by supper, and that single fact has just changed the shape of 40 separate days. This is the portrait. This is the man as the age intended him to be seen, gleaming, enormous, entirely in command of a body that appears, from 20 feet away in good candlelight, to answer his every wish. It is the image stitched into tapestries and struck onto coins and painted, eventually, larger than life onto a palace wall by a German artist who will make the king's legs alone into a kind of monument. Beneath all of that gold, under the velvet and the rubies and the rolling, confident walk, there is a room he left less than 2 hours ago. A small room with a locked door and a single attendant, and what happened inside it is a story the tapestries were never going to tell. A story more uncomfortable and considerably more human than any coin or canvas would ever let on. This is 1539. Henry VIII is 48 years old, deep into the third decade of a reign that has already broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and buried 2 wives, one under a headsman's sword and one lowered into a plain grave at Peterborough. He has a 3rd wife now, Jane Seymour, dead of childbed fever 2 years past, and a son not yet 2 years old whose survival the whole of England is holding its breath for. He is, by any measure available to the century, the most powerful man on the island, a man whose mood by breakfast can end a career, redraw a map of churchland, or send a courtier's family into ruin before the dinner hour. And every single morning, before any of that power is exercised in public, his body does what every human body does, and one man in England is paid, trusted and quietly feared above almost anyone else at court for managing exactly that. His name, in the autumn of 1539, is Sir Thomas Heneage, and his office is the Groom of the Stool, and this hour is his. Not the king's. His, because the story of what actually happened behind that locked door, the herb-scented water, the fine linen, the pewter basin inspected like a physician reading a patient's chart, the rages that could follow a bad morning, the fortune a man could build from proximity like this, and the fortune's exact opposite. The axe, waiting for at least one of Heneage's predecessors in this very office. None of that survives in the portraits either. It survives in household accounts, in a handful of remarkable letters, in the records of a trial that ended on Tower Hill. This hour is drawn from those. Consider, for a moment, what the word intimacy actually meant inside a Tudor court. Not affection, not friendship in the way the word is used today, though both of those things could exist alongside it. Intimacy meant proximity to the body of the king, unguarded and unwitnessed by anyone else, at the exact moments when that body was least kingly and most simply a body. Tired, sore, straining, afraid of its own failures. The court of Henry VIII built an entire hierarchy of access around that single fact, and at the very top of it, closer to the king in his most unguarded hours than his own wives would ever be, sat a single office, held across the reign by only a handful of men, one of whom would die extraordinarily rich, and one of whom would die on the scaffold within 10 years of taking the post. This video is the story of that office, what it actually required of the men who held it, and what it actually cost them, not a polite version, a real one. Before we go further, if this is the kind of history you find worth sitting with, the version behind the state portrait rather than the one printed on the coin, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps a small channel keep telling these particular stories. And if there is a corner of a royal court, a decade, a reign that has been sitting at the back of your mind waiting to be opened up in exactly this way, leave a word about it in the comments. I read every one, even the ones that arrive well past midnight. We will move over the next several hours through the physical mechanics of the office itself. The object at its center, the substances used to clean a king's body and the substances used to purge it, the theory of medicine that made a bowel movement a matter of state, the money that passed through this same man's hands, the access that made him the most informed person at court after the king himself, and finally, the danger, because proximity of this kind, in a reign like this one, was never merely a privilege. It was a wager renewed every single morning on a king whose favor could turn as quickly and as completely as weather over the Thames. Let us begin where every one of Sir Thomas Heneage's mornings actually began, not in the presence chamber, gleaming under its canopy of estate, but behind a locked door with a box covered in black velvet, and a king who needed him more than anyone else alive. Thomas Heneage is not a young man by the standards of the Tudor court in 1539, somewhere in his early 40s. A man who began his career decades earlier in the sprawling household of Cardinal Wolsey, learning the particular discipline of managing a great man's daily needs before that great man fell, spectacularly and permanently, from royal favor. Heneage survived that fall, which was itself a kind of education, because he watched, at close range, exactly how quickly proximity to power could curdle into exile, and he carried that lesson with him when he transferred, cleanly and without apparent hesitation, into the king's own privy chamber. By 1536, the year his predecessor in this office went to the block, Heneage held the position himself, Groom of the Stool to Henry VIII of England, and he has now kept it, carefully, for 3 years. His body, away from court dress, is unremarkable in the way that suits a man in his position. He is neither tall nor short, neither notably strong nor notably frail, a man built for stamina rather than display, which matters more than it might sound. Because his working day begins before the king wakes and frequently does not end until well after the king sleeps. His hands, closely observed, tell a slightly different story than the rest of him. They are careful hands, precise, the hands of a man who has spent years learning to fold linen exactly so, to test the temperature of water with 2 fingers rather than a whole palm, to hold very still while someone considerably larger and considerably more powerful than himself does something private and occasionally painful an arm's length away. He sleeps poorly, by his own admission in a handful of surviving letters, and he has developed, over years of service, a habit of counting his own breaths while he waits outside a door for the king to finish dressing. A small private discipline that steadies him and that nobody at court has ever noticed him doing. What is expected of him every single day is a peculiar and exhausting combination of physical labor, medical vigilance, financial administration, and absolute, permanent discretion. He must know, before any physician does, the state of the king's body on any given morning. He must manage, from the same office, the flow of the king's personal money, a role that has made previous holders of this post into something close to ministers of the royal treasury. He must never appear tired, never appear disgusted, never repeat outside that locked door a single word spoken inside it, and he must do all of this while remaining, in every outward respect, invisible, a shadow standing just behind the king's shoulder in every portrait that will never actually include him. Heneage has done this for 3 years without a serious misstep, which is itself a considerable historical achievement given what happened to at least one of the men who held this exact office before him. There is one more thing worth knowing about him before this hour goes any further, a small private habit that appears nowhere in the official record. Because no clerk was ever assigned to notice something so ordinary, Heneage keeps, in a locked drawer of his own lodging within the palace, a single sheet of paper on which he has written, in a private shorthand only he can read, the date of every single day since he took this office that the king has risen in what Heneage privately calls, to no one but that page, a fair humour. It is not a diary. It is closer to a weather log, the private record of a man whose entire professional survival depends on reading a single body's daily condition more accurately than anyone else alive, and on that particular morning in the autumn of 1539. Before the gold and the velvet and the rolling walk into the presence chamber, Heneage is standing outside a locked door with a basin, waiting to find out what kind of day it is going to be. If you picture a king's toilet at all, you probably picture something close to a joke. A fancy chair with a hole cut into it, a bit of gilding to make the whole business feel appropriately royal, and not much else worth dwelling on. It is an easy image to hold, because it lets the mind slide past the object quickly. Treat it as a punchline rather than a genuine piece of Tudor furniture with its own history, its own budget line, and its own dedicated custodian whose entire career depended on its proper use. The actual object was considerably more deliberate than that, and considerably more revealing of exactly how the Tudor court thought about the body of its king. The device itself was called a close stool, and the name is precise in a way that repays attention. It was close because it enclosed what it concealed, a wooden box built to sitting height with a padded lid that opened to reveal a hole, and under that hole, held in a frame built specifically to receive it, a basin, usually pewter, sometimes earthenware. The box itself, for a king, was never plain wood left bare. Surviving household records describe close stools built for Henry VIII, covered in black velvet, trimmed with ribbon and gilt nails, the whole structure padded under the velvet with sheepskin so that the seat itself, the part of the object that actually touched the king's body, offered something closer to the comfort of a cushioned chair than the comfort of a plain bench. One order survives from decades earlier, made out for Hugh Dennis, the very first man to hold this office under Henry VII, specifying black velvet fringed with silk, 2 pewter basins and 4 broad yards of tawny cloth, a level of specificity that tells you plainly this was never treated as an afterthought of furniture. It was commissioned, itemized, and paid for with the same seriousness the crown applied to its jewels and its tapestries. The stool travelled. This detail matters more than it might first appear to, because a king in this period did not live in one palace. He moved, sometimes every few weeks, between Hampton Court, Whitehall, Greenwich, and a rotating handful of other houses, partly for the pleasures of hunting and partly, quite practically, because a great household staying too long in one place fouled its own drains and its own water faster than the surrounding land could clear it. The close stool moved with him, carried by servants in a leather case built specifically for the purpose, unpacked and reassembled in a small dedicated chamber, sometimes called the stool room, wherever the king happened to be staying that week. It was, in this sense, one of the most consistently intimate objects in the king's entire life, present in every single residence, assembled fresh each time by hands that had learned to do it quickly and without being asked. The room around it was kept deliberately small and deliberately private. set apart even from the already restricted privy chamber that only a handful of the king's closest attendants were permitted to enter at all. Where a public dinner might be witnessed by dozens of courtiers standing in careful order of precedence, the stool room was witnessed by exactly one person at a time, the groom of the stool himself, and this single fact, more than the velvet or the gilt nails, is what actually made the office so immensely valuable at court. It was not the object that mattered, it was the access the object required. A king surrounded from dawn until dusk by watching eyes had, in this one room, precisely one witness, and the entire architecture of Tudor power rewarded, with land, income, and influence, whichever man that witness happened to be. For Heneage, on an ordinary morning in the autumn of 1539, the ritual runs with the practiced ease of a task performed several thousand times before. He enters the stool room ahead of the king to confirm the basin is clean, the linen is warmed near the fire rather than left cold, and the water in its ewer has been scented. In the way it usually is, with a wash of rosewater, a preparation common enough in wealthier Tudor households that its presence here signals status rather than novelty. He waits by the door while the king is helped from his nightclothes by a second attendant, and when Henry crosses the small room and settles his considerable weight onto the velvet and sheepskin, Heneage steps forward and, for the length of whatever number of minutes the king's body requires that particular morning, becomes the single most important observer in the entire palace, because what he sees in the basin over the next few minutes will shape, in ways this hour is about to make clear, decisions that reach as far as foreign embassies and physicians' notes written up for men who will never themselves set foot in this room. Living history scholarship on the Tudor court, drawing on surviving household accounts and inventories, has confirmed just how much deliberate craft went into an object most modern visitors to a Tudor exhibit walk past without a second look. The historian Sarah Bryson, who has written specifically on the office and its material culture, has traced the pattern of these commissions across multiple reigns and found the same consistent logic every time. The close stool built and refurnished as carefully and as expensively as any other piece of royal furniture. Because in the particular logic of this court, the body of the king was never merely private. It was a matter of state even in its most ordinary functions, and the object built to receive those functions was dressed, quite literally, in the same velvet worn by the king himself. It is worth pausing on how differently this same daily necessity was managed only a few floors away, among the lesser households that filled a palace like Hampton Court during a royal visit. A minor courtier, a clerk, a junior member of the kitchen staff, none of them had access to anything resembling this arrangement. Chamber pots, close stools of far plainer construction, and in the case of the lowest servants, communal privies built directly into the palace walls and flushed, if they were flushed at all, by the natural fall of the Thames itself, served the same basic bodily function without any of the ceremony. The gap between the king's velvet-covered stool and a scullery maid's plain earthenware pot was not merely a gap in comfort. It was a precise physical map of where a person stood in the hierarchy of the entire kingdom, expressed in something as unavoidable as where and how a body relieved itself each morning. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the most powerful man in England required, every single day, the same basic act every person in his kingdom required, and that his court responded to that plain, universal fact not by pretending it did not exist, but by wrapping it, with total seriousness, in velvet and silk fringe, and a dedicated servant of real rank. The body was not something this particular culture agreed to overlook. It was something it agreed, very deliberately, to dress. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what it would actually feel like to hold a length of warmed linen against another person's bare skin, day after day, for years, the particular intimacy of a task most people perform only for themselves, or, if they are fortunate, for a child too young to manage it alone. That is where this story goes next, because the close stool itself was only the first half of the ritual. What followed it? The washing, the wiping, the careful attention to skin that in this particular king's case was neither young nor especially well, was its own separate labour, and it fell to the same pair of hands. Once the king had finished, Henniege's work had only properly begun. The basin was inspected, a matter this hour will return to shortly, and set aside for a servant waiting outside to remove. Then came the linen, kept warming near a small fire lit in the stool room, specifically for this purpose, even in summer, because cold cloth against bare skin was considered, correctly, an unnecessary discomfort easily avoided with a little planning. The cloth itself was fine, closely woven, softer than the linen used elsewhere in the household, because this was one of the few places in the entire palace where cost was never weighed against comfort. Warm water followed, poured from a ewer and scented, as it had been for the earlier washing, with rose water or a similar herbal infusion common to wealthier households of the period. And Henniege washed the king clean with the same unhurried, practiced attention a nurse gives a patient whose good opinion happens to also control the fate of nations. For most of Henry's reign, this would have been an unremarkable, if intimate, piece of routine service. By 1539, it was considerably more than that, because the king's body by this point in his life carried an injury that made this particular task both more demanding and more delicate than it had been in his younger years. In January of 1536, Henry had suffered a serious jousting accident, thrown from his horse and struck heavily enough that he was reported unconscious for close to 2 hours, an injury that reopened and worsened an earlier wound to his leg, sustained in a similar accident back in 1527. The 1527 injury had healed reasonably well under the care of the royal surgeon Thomas Vicary. The 1536 re-injury did not. Ulcers developed on both of the king's legs in the years that followed, chronic, weeping wounds that opened, partially closed, and reopened again with grim regularity, and by 1538 one of these had closed over entirely at the surface while continuing to fester under the surface, a dangerous development that left Henry, according to the alarmed reports of those attending him, briefly unable to speak. His physicians, fearing the trapped infection, had reached a point of genuine crisis. The everyday consequence of this injury, for a man in Henniege's position, was that the king's body required a level of careful physical handling that went well beyond the routine washing any groom of this office might have expected a generation earlier. Movement itself had become difficult for Henry by 1539, his legs painful enough that even the short walk from his bedchamber to the stool room could leave him short of breath and visibly uncomfortable, and the physicians attending him, chief among them the well-regarded Dr. William Butts, required regular reports on the condition of the wounds themselves, the colour of the discharge, the smell, the swelling. Details that folded directly into the same daily observation Henniege was already performing on the king's other bodily functions. The task of managing the king's most private and most literal bodily needs had, by this point in the reign, expanded to include managing a body in genuine chronic pain, and doing so with hands steady enough that the king himself, a man not known for patience with discomfort, tolerated the handling without complaint. There is a particular kind of skill required here that no amount of velvet or gilt nails on the furniture could ever substitute for. The skill of touch itself, knowing exactly how much pressure a cloth could bear against inflamed skin before it became its own small cruelty. Knowing when a king's sharp intake of breath meant simple discomfort and when it meant something worth reporting immediately to the physicians waiting outside. Henniege had, by 1539, 3 years of daily practice at exactly this kind of reading, an intimate, wordless fluency in a single body's particular tolerances that very few people in England, including most of the king's own physicians, could claim to match. It was not medical training in any formal sense. It was something closer to the fluency a devoted parent develops with an infant who cannot yet speak, except that the person in this case was the most powerful man in the kingdom, and a misjudgment carried consequences that no ordinary household would ever need to fear. The historian Tracy Borman, writing on the intimate mechanics of the Tudor Privy Chamber, has described this particular dimension of the groom's role as one of the most physically demanding and least discussed aspects of the entire office. Precisely because it sits at an uncomfortable intersection the era itself preferred not to examine too closely. The overlap between servant and something closer to a nurse, performed by a man of genuine rank and genuine political ambition rather than by anyone trained specifically in the medical arts. It was service that required a kind of humility entirely at odds with everything else the office offered in status and reward, and men who held this post learned to hold both truths at once: the immense privilege of the position and the plain, unglamorous physical labor it actually demanded of them each morning. Cast your attention, for a moment, to every other household in England conducting some version of this same ritual that same morning. A wife tending a husband's wound from a farm accident, a mother wiping a sick child clean, a daughter caring for an aging parent whose own body has stopped fully obeying its own wishes. The particular tenderness Heneage brought to Henry's legs each morning was not, in its basic shape, so different from what was happening in 1,000 ordinary households across the same kingdom that same hour. The velvet was different. The stakes attached to a single mistake were entirely different. But the plain physical fact underneath both, one person tending carefully to another person's suffering body, was exactly the same, and it is worth remembering that even inside a palace, even in service to a king, this labor never stopped being what it has always been in every century: an act of genuine and exhausting human care. Which brings us to the question that nobody at the Tudor court would ever have raised in polite company, but that an entire branch of the king's own medical establishment took with total seriousness as a matter of daily record. What exactly was Heneage looking at, and why did anyone in this palace think it mattered? If you imagine Tudor medicine at all, you probably imagine something closer to superstition than science: leeches and charms, and a doctor pressing an ear to a patient's chest and guessing. Some of that image is fair. But the framework actually governing Henry's medical care in 1539 was not superstition in any loose or unstructured sense. It was a coherent, centuries-old system, inherited from the ancient physician Galen and refined across generations of university-trained scholars. And it rested on a single foundational idea: that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health itself was nothing more or less than these 4 substances existing in the correct balance relative to one another. Illness, by this same logic, was simply an imbalance: too much of one humour, too little of another, and the entire practice of medicine consisted of identifying which humour had slipped out of proportion and correcting it. The bowel within this system was not an embarrassing footnote to health. It was one of the single most direct windows available into the body's internal state, because digestion was understood as the process by which the body sorted useful humour from waste, and anything that emerged from that process, in this framework, carried real diagnostic weight. A physician examining a patient's stool was doing something considerably closer, in the internal logic of the era, to a modern doctor reading a blood panel than to anything a modern mind would associate with mere bathroom humour. Colour mattered, because different colours were read as evidence of different humoral imbalances. Consistency mattered, because it indicated how thoroughly digestion had actually completed its work. Even odour was taken as evidence, on the theory that a body properly balanced produced waste that, while never pleasant, fell within an expected range, and any significant deviation from that range signalled something the physicians needed to know. For a king this closely watched, this theoretical framework translated into a very literal daily practice. Heneage was expected to report each morning on precisely these qualities, and this was not treated as an unusual or invasive request within the household. It was simply how medicine worked. His observations were passed along to the king's physicians, chief among them Dr. William Butts, a man of genuine scholarly reputation who had studied at Cambridge and who Henry trusted enough to keep close at hand for decades of his reign. Butts and the other physicians attending the king used these daily reports the way a modern physician might use a patient's vital signs, as a baseline against which any change could be measured and interpreted, feeding directly into decisions about diet, activity, and the various remedies this hour will describe shortly. There was, layered on top of the pure humoral theory, an additional dimension that a modern mind finds even stranger: the era's persistent belief that the body's internal state was connected to the movements of the stars and planets, an astrological medicine practiced alongside humoral medicine rather than instead of it. Physicians of this period commonly consulted almanacs before administering treatment, timing purges and bleedings to what they understood as favorable astrological conditions, on the theory that the same celestial forces governing tides and seasons also governed the tides of the human body. Whether Butts himself leaned heavily on this dimension of the practice in Henry's specific case is less clearly documented than the humoral framework itself. But the broader medical culture surrounding the king took it seriously enough that almanacs specifying auspicious days for various treatments circulated widely among physicians of real standing. A detail that shows just how differently this century understood the relationship between a human body and the wider universe surrounding it. None of this was practiced in isolation from the king's temperament, and this is where the daily report took on a weight that went well beyond ordinary medical record-keeping. Henry believed in this system as completely as his physicians did. He understood his own body, or believed he understood it, through exactly this same humoral lens, and he had, by 1539, developed a genuine and increasingly consuming interest in his own health that went considerably beyond passive patienthood. In the years immediately following this one, Henry would compile, in his own hand and with contributions from physicians he trusted, a personal book of medical remedies containing close to 200 separate recipes, many of them credited directly to the king's own devising. A document that survives today as remarkable evidence of just how personally and technically engaged Henry had become with the management of his own body. A king this invested in his own medical theory did not receive a report on his morning's condition passively. He received it the way a scholar receives new evidence for a theory he has already spent years refining, and Heneage's daily observations became, in this particular king's mind, genuine data in an ongoing and deeply personal investigation. Picture, for a moment, the specific texture of this exchange on an ordinary morning. Heneage does not simply glance and move on. He examines the basin with real attention, noting color, noting consistency, forming the judgment he will need to deliver, sometimes to the king directly and sometimes through an intermediary, within the hour. This is not a task he can rush or perform carelessly, because a wrong or imprecise report could send the day's medical decisions in an entirely mistaken direction, and Henry, whatever else can be said about his temperament, possessed a memory for exactly this kind of failure. Heneage has learned, across 3 years in this office, to describe what he observes with a vocabulary precise enough to satisfy physicians trained at Cambridge and Oxford. A strange and highly specific expertise that exists nowhere else in his life and that he could never have anticipated needing when he first entered royal service decades earlier under Wolsey. The broader context here matters enormously, because this was never a practice unique to Henry or even to royalty generally. Physicians across every level of English society that could afford one relied on exactly this same basic framework, and household manuals and medical texts of the period routinely advised ordinary readers on how to interpret their own bodily signs using the same humoral vocabulary the royal physicians applied to the king. The difference at court was not the underlying theory, it was the sheer density of expert attention brought to bear on a single body and the seriousness with which a delay or an error in reporting could be treated. An ordinary Tudor household managed its own health with a mixture of folk remedy, household manual, and occasional consultation with an apothecary. Henry's household managed his with a standing team of university-trained physicians, receiving daily, itemized reports from a dedicated attendant whose entire career depended on the accuracy of his own observation. There is something worth pausing on here, a genuine reframing of what might otherwise read as merely an unusual or uncomfortable historical footnote. What Heneage performed each morning was not humiliation dressed up as duty. Within the medical logic of his own century, it was a form of diagnostic labor taken as seriously by the men practicing it as any bloodletting or pulse reading, grounded in a coherent, if ultimately mistaken, theory of how the human body actually worked. The physicians of 1539 were not fools. They were working, with real intellectual seriousness, from the best framework available to them, and the daily report Heneage delivered was, within that framework, genuine medical evidence gathered with the same careful attention a modern nurse brings to a chart at the foot of a hospital bed. Each of the four humours within this system carried its own set of qualities: blood warm and moist, phlegm cold and moist, yellow bile warm and dry, black bile cold and dry, and a physician's whole diagnostic art lay in weighing a patient's symptoms against this fourfold grid and prescribing whatever combination of diet, rest, medicine, or bloodletting would nudge the balance back towards center. Diet itself was treated as a form of medicine under this same framework, certain foods classified as heating and drying, others as cooling and moistening, and a physician attending a king with digestive trouble might just as easily prescribe a change in the kitchen as a change in the medicine chest, recommending lighter meat, less of the rich, heavily sauced dishes that dominated royal dining, or a shift away from strong wine towards something the era considered gentler on a body already struggling to process what it consumed. Henry's physicians did not always agree among themselves on the precise weighting of these factors, and surviving records from the period show genuine, occasionally sharp disagreement between university-trained physicians over the correct interpretation of a given set of symptoms. A reminder that Tudor medicine, whatever its ultimate limitations, was practiced by men capable of real intellectual dispute rather than blind adherence to a single fixed formula. Heneage's own reports fed directly into these debates, raw material for physicians arguing with genuine scholarly seriousness about the best way to restore balance to the body of the one patient whose health mattered more than any other in the kingdom. Now, the question of temper, because the daily report was never merely a piece of passive record-keeping delivered into a void. It travelled upward, into the mind of a man whose moods by 1539 had become one of the most closely studied and most carefully managed phenomena at the entire English court, and a bad morning in the stool room had a way of becoming, within a matter of hours, a bad morning for everyone standing anywhere near the king. Henry VIII, by this point in his reign, suffered, with real and worsening regularity, from constipation, a condition his own physicians took seriously enough to document and treat as an ongoing medical concern rather than an occasional inconvenience. The likely causes were exactly what a modern physician would suspect looking at the same case from 4 centuries distance. A diet unusually heavy in meat and rich sauces and remarkably light in the fruit, vegetables, and roughage that a Tudor court considered fit mainly for the poor, combined with a body that by 1539 could no longer take the exercise it once had, the king's damaged legs having curtailed the hunting and the tennis and the long days on horseback that had kept him considerably more active in his younger years. The digestive system of a man eating like a king and moving like an invalid produced, with grim predictability, exactly the kind of chronic sluggishness his physicians spent considerable effort trying to correct. The consequence of this, for everyone in Henry's immediate orbit, was a king whose physical discomfort translated with unusual speed into something considerably more dangerous than ordinary irritability. Contemporary accounts of the king's temperament in this period consistently describe a man capable of sudden, violent shifts in mood, generous and jovial one hour and coldly, frighteningly furious the next, and while the underlying causes of any single outburst were rarely recorded with the specificity a modern reader might want, the pattern connecting physical discomfort to explosive temper was well understood by everyone serving close enough to observe it directly. A king in genuine physical pain, whether from his legs or from several days of failed digestion, was a king whose patience for delay, for disappointing news, for the ordinary friction of court business, had worn down to almost nothing, and the men around him had learned, through hard experience, to read his body for warning signs the way a sailor reads a darkening sky. This placed Hennieg in a position of genuine and daily peril that had nothing to do with any conscious wrongdoing on his part. He was, each morning, the very first person to know precisely how the day was likely to unfold, before the king's council, before the ambassadors waiting for an audience, before the wife the king had married 2 years earlier, and would, within months of this particular autumn, already be manoeuvring to replace. A morning of failed digestion meant a foul day ahead, and Hennieg, as the single earliest witness to that fact, carried both a genuine informational advantage and a genuine personal exposure, because he was also, in a sense no other courtier could claim, present at the exact moment the king's temper began to sour, close enough that any spillover of frustration had nowhere else in the room to land. There is a particular kind of skill this demanded that went well beyond the physical labor already described. A skill closer to what a modern reader might recognize in an experienced hospice nurse or a seasoned parent of a colicky infant. The ability to move through a difficult, painful morning with a body that cannot fully explain what is wrong with it, offering exactly the right combination of efficiency and calm that neither provokes further frustration nor appears indifferent to genuine suffering. Hennieg had learned across years of exactly this kind of mourning to move quickly without appearing rushed, to speak little and choose what he did say with real care, and to absorb, without visible reaction, whatever sharp word or cold silence a particularly bad morning produced, because a flinch or a wounded expression from the one man permitted to witness the king at his most physically miserable would have been, in the strict etiquette of this court, its own small failure of service. The broader pattern here connects directly to something historians of the Tudor court have long recognized about Henry's temperament in general. The degree to which his physical suffering, particularly in the second half of his reign, shaped decisions that rippled outward into matters of genuine state importance. A council meeting delayed because the king was indisposed. A foreign ambassador kept waiting for an audience because Henry's legs were paining him too badly that morning for him to appear in public. A courtier's minor request refused with unusual harshness on a day when the underlying cause had nothing to do with the request itself and everything to do with a body that had simply stopped cooperating. The historian Susanna Lipscomb, among others who have studied Henry's later reign closely, has argued that the king's physical decline after 1536 cannot be separated from the political volatility of his final decade. That a body in chronic pain produced a court in chronic uncertainty, and that the men closest to that body, Hennieg very much included, were managing not merely a patient, but, in a very real sense, the emotional weather of the entire kingdom. For all the danger embedded in this particular piece of the office, there is something worth noticing in how thoroughly Hennieg had learned to navigate it by 1539. He was not merely enduring these mornings, he had built, across 3 years of daily practice, a genuine professional competence in exactly this kind of emotional and physical management, a skill set that, translated into any other century, might be recognized and credentialed in its own right, and that in this one existed only as an unspoken, unrecorded fluency passed down informally from one groom of the stool to the next, refined in the body of a single man through nothing but repeated, careful, attentive practice. Picture, for a moment, the specific choreography of a truly bad morning, the kind Hennieg had learnt to recognize within seconds of entering the stool room. The king's color is poor. His breathing carries a faint, irritated edge before a single word has been exchanged. Hennieg does not ask how the king slept. because the answer is already written plainly enough across the room's whole atmosphere, and a question, no matter how well intended, risks sounding like a demand for conversation the king has no patience to give. He moves the water a little closer, checks its warmth again, though he checked it only minutes before, and waits, silent, present, entirely available without being in any way intrusive, until the king is ready to speak or not speak as he chooses. If the news that follows, whether from the basin or simply from the king's own mood, is bad, Heneage carries it forward exactly as far as it needs to go, and no further, delivered to the physicians waiting outside in language calm enough that nobody down the corridor mistakes an ordinary difficult morning for a genuine crisis, and specific enough that if it is a genuine crisis, nobody wastes a single unnecessary minute finding that out. This is the entire craft of the office compressed into a handful of minutes, repeated with only minor variation across thousands of mornings, refined until it requires no visible effort at all. Though the effort, this hour has tried to show clearly, was never actually absent. It had simply become, through years of exactly this kind of practice, invisible even to the man performing it. The quiet truth sitting underneath this particular chapter of the story is simply this. The most powerful man in England was, on his worst mornings, entirely at the mercy of his own digestion and everyone around him, from his physicians to his council to the ambassadors of foreign kings, had learned to plan their day around a variable as mundane and as universal as whether or not a 48-year-old body cooperated before breakfast. Power, it turns out, was never quite as separate from plumbing as the portraits like to suggest. The reality of what happened once constipation had been diagnosed, rather than merely endured, takes this story into territory that a modern reader will likely find considerably stranger than anything described so far. If you imagine a king's medicine cabinet, you probably imagine something dignified, tinctures in glass, powders measured with careful precision, perhaps a physician's grave Latin murmured over the whole affair. The actual remedies administered to correct the king's digestion were, by modern standards, closer to a controlled assault on the body than to gentle treatment, and the fact that they were administered under direct royal supervision, sometimes at the king's own specific request, only makes the picture stranger still. The standard treatments available to Henry's physicians for constipation drew from a set of purgative substances well established across European medicine of the period. Rhubarb, imported at real expense from trade routes stretching toward China, was prized specifically for its purgative strength and was administered in powdered or infused form to stimulate the bowel directly. Senna, a plant native to parts of Africa and the Middle East and imported through similar long trade networks, worked by a related mechanism and was frequently combined with other ingredients into compound pills designed to intensify the effect. And mercury, the substance a modern reader will likely find most alarming of the three, was administered specifically because its purgative action was considered exceptionally strong and exceptionally fast, a substance physicians of this period reached for across an enormous range of ailments, from digestive complaints to the treatment of syphilis, entirely unaware of the slow, cumulative poisoning that repeated use could inflict on the body it was meant to be curing. These substances were rarely administered on their own. Physicians of the period frequently compounded them into pills taken by mouth or combined them into what the era called a glister, a liquid preparation introduced directly into the bowel through a syringe-like instrument, functioning in essence as an enema and delivering its purgative ingredients with considerably more direct and immediate force than any pill swallowed and left to work its way through the entire digestive tract first. For a case of genuine several days constipation, physicians frequently reached for both approaches together. A pill to work on the system generally, and a glister to provide more immediate, targeted relief, and the combination, applied to a body already sore and swollen from days of digestive failure, produced an experience that even Tudor sources, not generally given to squeamishness about such matters, describe with a certain grim frankness. We have, remarkably, a direct account of exactly this treatment applied to Henry himself in the very autumn this story is set in. In September of 1539, Heneage wrote to Thomas Cromwell, then still the king's chief minister, describing the king's condition and its resolution in language precise enough that it survives 4 centuries later as one of the single most vivid pieces of evidence historians have for exactly how this process actually unfolded. Heneage reported that the king had taken his prescribed pills and glister, slept until 2 in the morning, and then risen to use the close stool, where, in Heneage's own words, preserved in the letter itself, the treatment had produced what he described as a very fair siege. The word siege in this context was contemporary medical vocabulary for a bowel movement, and Heneage's phrasing, a very fair one, was not a private joke between servant and minister. It was a formal, positive medical report, delivered in exactly the vocabulary the moment required, confirming to Cromwell, and through him to the wider circle of men whose own political fortunes rose and fell with the king's health, that the crisis of the preceding days had been successfully resolved. Consider what this letter actually represents, set alongside everything this hour has already described. A grown man, one of the most senior and trusted servants in the entire royal household, sat down and composed a careful written report to the king's chief minister, describing in specific clinical language the precise nature and timing of the king's bowel movement, and that report was read, filed, and treated as important political and medical information, worth writing down, worth sending, worth preserving. This was not gossip. It was not an embarrassing aside slipped into a longer letter about matters of actual substance. For the men managing Henry's court in 1539, this letter was matters of actual substance, because a king relieved of several days' painful constipation was a king considerably less likely to erupt at his council, considerably more likely to receive an ambassador with something resembling patience, and considerably more capable, in the most literal physical sense, of conducting the business of governing an entire kingdom. For Heneage personally, administering these treatments meant standing beside the king through what could be, depending on the severity of the case, a genuinely difficult and uncomfortable process, holding him steady if needed, managing the instruments involved in a glister with the same careful, practiced hands he brought to every other part of this office, and absorbing whatever discomfort or frustration the king expressed during a treatment that even a healthy adult finds difficult to undergo. Once the treatment had done its work, Heneage returned to the observational role this hour has already described, examining the results, forming his judgment and preparing the report that would travel, in one form or another, all the way to the desk of the king's own chief minister. The broader medical context here deserves a moment of real attention, because the men prescribing mercury, rhubarb, and senna to the King of England were not reckless amateurs experimenting blindly on a captive patient. They were working within the most sophisticated medical framework their century possessed, trained at England's finest universities, applying remedies whose purgative effects were observably real, even if the underlying theory explaining why they worked was, by modern understanding, mistaken in its particulars. Mercury's danger in particular was invisible to them in a way that is difficult for a modern reader to fully appreciate. Its toxic accumulation in the body producing symptoms, tremor, mood disturbance, eventual organ damage that a physician working entirely within humoral theory had no framework for connecting back to the very treatment meant to help. Whether the mercury Henry received across his later years contributed meaningfully to his own declining health and temperament in the final decade of his reign remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate, one historians and medical researchers continue to examine using the surviving records of exactly this kind of treatment. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Heneage's letter to Cromwell, written to resolve an urgent and entirely private medical matter, survives today as one of our clearest windows into the actual daily texture of Henry's court. More vivid in its way than any state paper or diplomatic dispatch from the same autumn. History, it turns out, sometimes preserves its most revealing evidence in exactly the places the participants themselves would have least expected anyone to ever look again. The performance of intimate physical service, meanwhile, was only half the office. There was a second dimension to Henij's daily work, considerably less visceral than anything described so far, but arguably more consequential to the actual governance of the kingdom, and it concerned money, specifically the king's own personal money, kept entirely separate from the great machinery of the royal treasury and placed, almost without check, directly into the hands of the man who also emptied his chamber pot. To understand why this arrangement existed at all requires a brief detour into how Henry VII, the current king's father, had reorganized royal finance decades earlier. Traditional royal income in medieval England had flowed through the exchequer, a large, formal, and often slow-moving bureaucratic institution accountable to established procedure and, in theory, to Parliament. Henry VII, a notably careful and even miserly monarch by the standards of his own century, had grown frustrated with the exchequer's sluggishness and had shifted an increasing share of royal income into a separate stream managed directly through his own privy chamber, a system historians now refer to as the chamber system of Tudor finance. This reorganization required someone trusted enough to manage it, and the office created to serve that private financial function was the very same office already responsible for the king's most literal private care, the Groom of the Stool. By the time Henry VIII inherited the throne, this arrangement was well established, and the Groom of the Stool had become, in the words of the historian David Starkey, who has written extensively on the structure and politics of the Tudor Privy Chamber, something close to a virtual minister of the royal treasury. The Groom oversaw the expenditures of what was called the Privy Purse, the king's own personal and discretionary funds, entirely separate from public state spending, used for everything from gambling debts and gifts to mistresses and favoured courtiers to funding building projects the king wished to pursue without the delay of formal exchequer approval, to the quiet, deniable payments that any powerful court occasionally required and never wished to see itemised in a public account. The Groom kept the accounts, authorised the disbursements, and answered, in practice, to almost nobody but the king himself. Henij's predecessor in this specific financial dimension of the role, William Compton, the very first man to hold the office under Henry VIII, had used exactly this position to build one of the largest personal fortunes accumulated by any commoner in England during the entire Tudor period. Compton entered royal service as a companion to the young king, close in age and close in temperament, sharing Henry's early enthusiasm for jousting, hunting, and the general athletic display expected of a young Renaissance monarch determined to prove himself the physical equal of any king in Europe. Through the office of Groom of the Stool, Compton gained not merely proximity, but genuine financial leverage, accumulating land grants, leases, and offices that by the middle of the 1520s brought him an annual income that rivaled or exceeded that of England's lesser nobility, a staggering rise for a man from comparatively modest Warwickshire origins. Compton held the post for close to 2 decades and, by the time of his death from the sweating sickness in 1528, had transformed himself from a minor gentleman companion into one of the wealthiest commoners in the entire kingdom. To understand what this actually meant in the texture of ordinary 16th century life, it helps to set Compton's fortune against the wages of the people around him. A skilled craftsman in Tudor England, a mason or a carpenter working steady employment, might earn somewhere in the range of a few pounds across an entire year of honest labour. Compton's own annual income from his accumulated land and offices ran to a sum many, many times that figure, placing him, by the standards of his own century, closer to the greater gentry or lesser nobility than to the commoner status his birth had actually assigned him. This was the kind of transformation this particular office made possible, not a modest supplement to an existing income, but a genuine leap across the boundaries that otherwise governed a person's entire station in life, and it happened by exactly this route. Proximity to the king's body converted, patiently and deliberately, into land, into leases, into the kind of accumulated wealth that could then be passed down to reshape an entire family's fortunes for generations to come. Heneage, watching this same pattern from close range as he managed his own version of the office 3 years into his own tenure, understood precisely what kind of transformation remained available to him if he chose to pursue it as aggressively as Compton once had, and precisely what kind of exposure that same pursuit might invite. For Heneage, 3 years into holding this same financial authority in 1539, the daily reality of the Privy Purse work looked considerably less dramatic than Compton's spectacular accumulation of wealth, but it was, in its own way, just as demanding of careful judgment. Every payment the king wished to make outside the formal channels of state finance passed across Heneage's desk in some form, and Heneage was expected to manage these funds with an accuracy and discretion that left no room for the kind of error that might invite scrutiny from Cromwell's own increasingly centralized financial apparatus, itself busy in this same period absorbing enormous new wealth from the recently dissolved monasteries into the crown's coffers. Heneage's own position required him to be, simultaneously, entirely loyal to the king's private financial wishes and entirely careful never to create the appearance of impropriety that a political rival might seize upon, a balance that demanded real skill in an environment where Cromwell himself, the most powerful minister in England, watched the flow of royal money with close and interested attention. The broader context here reveals something important about how power actually functioned inside this court, a fact easily obscured by the more visceral details of basins and linen already described. Physical intimacy with the king's body granted access. Access in turn granted financial authority, because a king who trusted a man to witness his most private bodily functions was, by the same logic, a king willing to trust that same man with his private purse. The two dimensions of the office were never separate in practice, different as they might appear on paper, and any man holding this post understood that his value to the king rested on both forms of trust operating together, seamlessly, as a single continuous relationship of intimate service. This financial dimension of the role also explains something that might otherwise seem strange about why courtiers and even foreign ambassadors took such careful, deliberate pains to remain on good terms with a man whose formal title referred to something as unglamorous as a chamber pot. A groom of the Stool with genuine influence over the flow of royal money and genuine daily access to the king's private mood and private conversation was a man worth cultivating regardless of what his title actually described. And the historical record shows exactly this pattern playing out across multiple reigns. Courtiers seeking the groom's favor not despite the intimate nature of his duties, but, in an important sense, because of it. The office's apparent humility was, paradoxically, the very source of its genuine political weight. There is something clarifying in recognizing just how thoroughly this single office fused the most private and the most political dimensions of royal life into one continuous responsibility, carried by one man, managed with one set of hands. Compton had ridden that fusion to a fortune that made him, by the end of his life, wealthier than many men who had been born to titles he never held. Heneage, more cautious by temperament and shaped, quite possibly, by the fall of Wolsey that had opened his own career, managed the same fusion of trust with considerably more restraint, building a solid and respectable fortune of his own without ever reaching for the scale of wealth his predecessor had achieved. Both approaches, as this hour will eventually show, came with their own particular risks, because an office this deeply woven into a king's private life offered no path to genuine safety, only different shapes of exposure to the same fundamental danger. For Heneage, this particular chapter of the office presented a challenge on a day like the one this story keeps returning to, because the intimacy already described, the body, the basin, the purse, was never the full extent of what closeness to the king actually demanded. There was a further layer still, quieter than any of it, and in some ways more revealing than all the rest combined. And it concerned simply being present, hour after hour, in rooms where almost nobody else in England was ever permitted to stand. The Privy Chamber itself, the suite of rooms lying just beyond the more public presence chamber and guard chamber that made up the bulk of a Tudor royal residence, was a space defined entirely by restriction. Where the guard chamber might hold dozens of household officers and the presence chamber dozens more courtiers and petitioners hoping for a glimpse of royal favour, the Privy Chamber admitted only a small, carefully chosen circle. Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a handful of trusted body servants, and, closer still, the Groom of the Stool, who alone among this already exclusive group had access to the king's most private moments without exception. Heneage helped dress the king each morning, a task considerably more involved than a modern reader might assume given the layered complexity of Tudor court costume, doublet, hose, a jewelled collar, the various pins and points that held an outfit like Henry's together, each piece handed and fastened in careful sequence by hands that had performed the same choreography thousands of times. He helped undress the king each night, reversing the same careful sequence, and in the between hours he was simply there, present in rooms where the king spoke freely, because he believed, correctly in Heneage's case, that nothing said within those walls would travel further. This proximity meant that Heneage frequently slept within call of the king's own bedchamber, a detail that placed him, quite literally, closer to Henry through the night than any other person at court apart from whichever wife currently shared the royal bed, and by 1539, with Jane Seymour 2 years dead and no queen yet installed, that comparison tilted even further in Heneage's favour. He was present, in some form, for the small, unguarded moments that never made it into any official account. The king's private complaints about a counsellor's slowness, an unguarded joke about a foreign ambassador's poor grasp of English manners, a moment of genuine, unperformed worry about the health of the infant Prince Edward, whose survival, as this story has already noted, the entire kingdom was anxiously watching. None of this was written down by Heneage himself in any surviving source, and this hour will not pretend otherwise, inventing conversations that no document records would betray exactly the kind of historical carelessness this channel exists to avoid. What can be stated with confidence, because the structure of the office itself makes it unavoidable, is that a man in Heneage's position necessarily witnessed exactly this category of unguarded royal moment, routinely, as an unavoidable condition of doing his job at all. The practical consequence of this closeness was that Heneage became, whether he actively sought the role or simply inherited it through the mechanics of his office, one of the small handful of people in England capable of reading the king's true mood with real accuracy, as distinct from the mood Henry chose to perform for a council chamber or a foreign delegation. A king could compose his face for an ambassador. He could not, in any sustained way, compose it for the man handing him his shirt at 6 a.m. or standing beside his close stool an hour later. This gave Heneage a form of knowledge that no formal title could fully capture, an intimate, accumulated understanding of one specific human being's private truth, gathered not through conversation or confidence, but through the simple, repeated, unglamorous proximity of daily service. Living history research into the structure of the Tudor Privy Chamber, reconstructed from surviving household ordinances and the detailed accounts kept of who was permitted where and at what hours, has confirmed just how deliberately this hierarchy of access was maintained across the whole of Henry's reign. The historian David Loades, who wrote extensively on the structure of the Tudor royal household, described the Privy Chamber as functioning almost as its own small, self-contained court within the larger court, governed by rules of intimacy and trust that had little to do with formal rank and everything to do with a king's own personal comfort and preference. A duke standing in the presence chamber, robed and titled and truly powerful in the wider machinery of the kingdom, might never once in his life witness the king in the state Heneage witnessed him in every single morning, and this inversion, a comparatively modest gentleman holding access that dukes themselves were denied tells you something important about how differently this court actually distributed its most valuable currency, which was never land or title alone, but proximity itself. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely, because it means the single most informed person in England about the private state of its king was, by any conventional measure of noble rank, a relatively minor figure, a gentleman rather than a lord, holding his extraordinary influence not through blood or title, but through the sheer accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary, unglamorous mornings spent doing a job most people at court would have found beneath their own dignity to perform. The court's obsession with formal precedence, so visible in every ceremony and every seating arrangement, sat directly alongside this quieter, unofficial hierarchy of genuine intimacy, and the two systems, different as their outward logic was, operated side by side, each shaping the real distribution of power at court in ways the other could never fully capture on its own. It is worth being precise here about exactly who stood where within this same privy chamber, because the era maintained several distinct grades of intimate service, each carrying its own particular claim to the king's trust, without ever quite reaching the singular access this office alone provided. Sir William Sidney, a gentleman who served Henry for decades and stood beside him at the great diplomatic spectacle of the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, held the related office of Esquire of the Body, a genuine position of honour within the same close circle of attendants, responsible for guarding the king's person and assisting with the general business of the Privy Chamber, and later trusted enough to be named steward and tutor to the infant Prince Edward himself. Sidney's career shows plainly how many separate, legitimately prestigious routes existed into this same inner world of royal intimacy, and how carefully Tudor households distinguished between them. An esquire of the body stood close, the groom of the stool stood closer still, and it was that final, narrowest degree of closeness, rather than any broader category of privy chamber service, that carried both the singular reward and the singular danger this hour has spent so long describing. There is something worth pausing on here before this hour moves further, because the closeness this chapter has described was never simply a pleasant privilege, whatever it might look like from a comfortable distance. It was a form of exposure as much as access, a constant, unbroken proximity to a temperament that could shift without warning, and the very intimacy that made Heneage valuable, that let him read the king's true mood before anyone else in the palace, was the same intimacy that placed him, every single day, closer to the centre of the storm than almost anyone else alive. Sensory bridge or not, the plain fact of the matter deserves stating directly. Everything this hour has described so far, the basin, the linen, the purse, the private rooms, converted into something else entirely once it left the walls of the Privy Chamber and travelled into the wider world of foreign courts and domestic politics. It converted into leverage, and leverage of exactly the kind that made the men who wielded it simultaneously indispensable and, as this hour will soon make clear, deeply exposed. Foreign ambassadors resident at the Tudor court operated under a permanent, structural disadvantage that modern diplomacy has largely engineered away. They had no reliable, independent means of assessing the king's true health, temperament, or private inclinations on any given day, and yet their entire professional function, reporting accurately back to the monarchs who employed them, depended on exactly that kind of assessment. A Spanish or French ambassador drafting a dispatch home about the likelihood of a new alliance, a marriage negotiation, or a shift in England's religious policy needed to know, as precisely as possible, what mood the king was actually in, whether his health was truly stable or quietly declining, whether a coming audience was likely to go well or badly. Official channels offered only the polished, performed version of the king, the same gleaming figure this hour opened with, striding into the presence chamber under his canopy of estate. The unperformed version, the version that actually determined how a negotiation would go, lived behind a door that only a handful of men in England were ever permitted to open. This created, inevitably, a quiet market in exactly the kind of information Heneage possessed by default. simply by doing his job. Surviving diplomatic correspondence from across Henry's reign shows ambassadors cultivating relationships with precisely the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber best positioned to offer some genuine insight into the king's private state, sometimes through direct gifts, sometimes through the more general cultivation of goodwill that any experienced diplomat understood was worth the investment. The historian Eric Ives, in his extensive study of the Tudor court's inner workings, has traced this pattern across multiple reigns and found it operating with remarkable consistency. Foreign envoys treating access to the Privy Chamber's inner circle as a genuine intelligence asset, worth cultivating with the same seriousness they applied to any other source of information about the English crown's actual intentions. For Henijs himself, this placed him in a position of considerable, if quiet, influence whenever a foreign delegation arrived at court. He would not have negotiated treaties or set policy, roles that belonged to Cromwell and the king's formal council. But an ambassador wondering whether to press a delicate point that morning, or wait for a better one, might reasonably seek some small signal from a man known to have witnessed the king's condition before anyone else in the palace that day. A subtle nod, a carefully neutral comment about the king having slept well, even simple silence where a warmer greeting might otherwise have been expected, all of it carried genuine informational weight in a court this starved of reliable insight into its own monarch's private state. Henijs understood, as every man who held this office before him had understood, that his silence was as valuable and as carefully weighed as anything he might actually choose to say. Domestic courtiers operated under the exact same logic, perhaps with even sharper stakes attached. A councillor hoping to raise a difficult matter with the king, a petitioner seeking a land grant, a bishop anxious about the crown's next move against church property, all of them benefited enormously from knowing, in advance, whether the king was likely to be receptive or explosive that particular day. Cromwell himself, for all his own formidable web of intelligence and informants stretching across the entire kingdom, still relied on exactly the kind of granular, immediate reporting Henijs's September letter demonstrates, evidence that even the most powerful minister in England found it worthwhile to maintain a direct line to the man who knew the king's body and temperament more intimately than anyone else. Alive. This was not a minor courtesy extended between colleagues. It was a genuine political relationship, cultivated deliberately, because Cromwell's own survival at court depended, in no small part, on knowing exactly how to time his approaches to a king whose mood could shift the fate of an entire policy within a single morning. The stakes attached to this kind of knowledge were rising sharply in exactly this particular autumn, because 1539 sat in the very middle of the dissolution of the monasteries, the sweeping campaign, driven by Cromwell and authorized by successive acts of Parliament since 1536, that had already closed hundreds of religious houses across England and funneled their land and wealth directly into the Crown's own coffers. Bishops and abbots watching this process unfold, wondering whether their own house would be the next surrendered or seized, had every reason to seek whatever advance warning they could find of the king's mood and the king's evolving religious sympathies. And a court this attentive to signals of royal favour treated the Privy Chamber's inner circle, Henijs very much included, as one genuine source of exactly that kind of advance warning. A churchman uncertain whether to resist a coming visitation or negotiate a quiet surrender might reasonably weigh, among his other considerations, whatever fragments of the king's private temper had managed to reach him through the court's informal channels of gossip and cultivated goodwill. Channels that ran, in no small part, directly through the same stool room this hour has spent so long describing. The broader pattern here connects directly to something historians of court politics across many different monarchies have long recognized: the fact that formal titles and formal channels of power rarely capture the full picture of how influence actually moves through a royal household. The genuine currency of a court like this one was information, specifically information about the monarch's private state, and the men who controlled access to that information regardless of how humble their official title might sound, held a form of power that dukes and bishops were often forced to quietly court. Heneage's title referred to a chamber pot. His actual daily function, in the eyes of every foreign ambassador and every ambitious courtier at Hampton Court that autumn, was considerably closer to gatekeeper of the single most valuable intelligence asset in the entire kingdom, the private mind and body of Henry VIII himself. There is a particular kind of vertigo worth sitting with here, the recognition that the single most literal, physical, unglamorous task available at the Tudor court, quite possibly the least dignified job description any nobleman could imagine holding, had become, through nothing more complicated than sustained proximity, one of the most politically consequential positions in the entire government of England. The court's own formal hierarchy, so visible in every ceremony and every carefully ordered procession, sat directly alongside this quieter and considerably more accurate map of where real influence actually lived, and anyone at court paying close attention, which was, in practice, everyone, understood exactly which map to trust when something genuinely mattered. For Heneage, contemplating his own position on any ordinary morning in 1539, contemplation of danger was never an abstract exercise. It was a fact carried in the very structure of his own office, written into the documented fates of the two men who had held it immediately before him. And it is here that this hour must finally turn to the part of the story that gives every other chapter its true weight. Sir William Compton, the first groom of the Stool under Henry VIII, and the man whose fortune this story has already described, died in June of 1528, not by execution, but by the sweating sickness, a swift and terrifying epidemic illness that swept through England periodically across the 16th century and killed with a speed that left little time for the elaborate rituals of a state. Execution. Compton died wealthy, respected, and in possession of virtually everything his decades of intimate royal service had earned him: land across multiple counties, a fortune that rivaled the greater nobility, and a family position to carry that wealth forward into the next generation. His death, sudden as it was the death of a man who had, in every meaningful sense, won the wager this office demanded. He is the example every subsequent groom of the Stool would have known by heart, the proof that this particular closeness to the king could, under the right circumstances, produce a fortune few commoners in the whole of England ever achieved. Sir Henry Norris, who succeeded Compton in 1526 and held the office for a full decade, offers this story's opposite proof, and it is worth telling with the same careful attention to documented fact that this hour has applied to everything else. Norris had become, by the 1530s, deeply close to the king personally, a companion Henry trusted enough to visit informally, to confide in, to treat with a warmth the surviving record suggests was real rather than merely performed. He was also, through his position and his personal friendships at court, closely connected to Queen Anne Boleyn's own circle. A connection that in the spring of 1536, as Henry's marriage to Anne collapsed under the combined weight of the Queen's failure to produce a surviving male heir and the King's own wandering attention toward Jane Seymour, became suddenly and catastrophically dangerous. On the 1st of May 1536, Henry attended a jousting tournament at Greenwich with Anne at his side, an entirely ordinary court occasion that ended, without warning, in the King's abrupt departure for Westminster with only a small handful of attendants. Norris was among those called to ride with him, and according to the account of George Constantine, a servant of Norris who later wrote of the events, the King spent the ride interrogating Norris directly, asking whether he had committed adultery with the Queen and offering him a pardon in exchange for a confession. Norris, according to the surviving accounts of this exchange, refused, insisting on the Queen's innocence and his own, and the following morning he was taken to the Tower of London. He was tried on the 15th of May alongside the Queen's own brother and several other courtiers accused in the same widening investigation, convicted on evidence that most historians examining the case today consider deeply unpersuasive, and executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May 1536, alongside 4 other men, one of whom held no rank at all, and was executed by the crueler method reserved for commoners rather than the swift stroke granted to Norris and the others by virtue of their birth. At his own execution, by the account of witnesses, Norris said almost nothing, though other sources record him maintaining, to the very last, his belief in the Queen's innocence, a final act of loyalty that cost him whatever slim chance the King's earlier offer of pardon might once have represented. Consider what this means for the office Heneage now holds, and what it would have meant for any man stepping into this same role in the years immediately following Norris's death. The 2 most immediate predecessors in this exact position had met entirely opposite fates, one dying peacefully in possession of an enormous fortune, the other beheaded within days of the King's favour turning, on charges that rested on very little beyond timing and proximity to a queen who had suddenly become expendable. Both men had done, in essence, the identical job. Both men had earned the same intimate trust, the same daily closeness to the King's body and the King's private thoughts. And the difference between a peaceful death surrounded by inherited wealth and a public beheading on Tower Hill had turned, in Norris's case, not on any failure of service, but on the accident of his personal connections at the exact moment those connections became politically toxic. Heneage would have known every detail of this story with the vivid, personal clarity of a man who had entered this same office within months of Norris's execution, stepping into a role whose most recent occupant had been marched to the block for a set of accusations that, whatever their truth, had far more to do with court faction and royal caprice than with any genuine failure in the performance of his duties. This knowledge shaped, almost certainly, the particular caution that historians have long noted in Heneage's own approach to the office, a marked reluctance to accumulate the kind of visible, spectacular wealth Compton had built, and a careful, deliberate distance from the factional entanglements that had ultimately doomed Norris, where Compton had built an empire and Norris had built a friendship close enough to become fatal. Heneage, by every indication the surviving record offers, built something closer to careful, professional invisibility, present at the absolute center of royal intimacy while remaining, as much as such a position allowed, politically unremarkable. This caution reflects something historians of the period have long recognized as one of the defining features of survival at Henry's court in its later years. Thomas Cromwell himself, the most powerful commoner in England throughout the 1530s, would fall with almost identical suddenness in the summer of 1540, arrested at a council meeting and executed within weeks on charges his own biographers have long treated with considerable skepticism. Proximity to Henry VIII, this hour's evidence suggests again and again, was never a stable asset. It was a constantly renewing wager, and the men who survived longest at the center of his court were rarely the most brilliant or the most beloved. They were, more often, the most careful, the most willing to make themselves indispensable without ever becoming, in the way Norris had inadvertently become, entangled in a faction the King might one day need to destroy. It is worth remembering, too, exactly how many people the same investigation that destroyed Norris ultimately swept up alongside him. George Boleyn, the Queen's own brother, was tried and executed the same day, convicted on evidence historians have long treated with real skepticism. Francis Weston and William Brereton, both gentlemen of rank connected to the court's inner circle, died beside Norris on Tower Hill that same 17th of May, granted, by virtue of their birth, the comparative mercy of the headsman's axe. Mark Smeaton, a court musician of common birth, with no rank to spare him from the fuller cruelty the law reserved for men outside the gentry, suffered a considerably harsher death the same morning. A distinction in method that mapped, with uncomfortable precision, onto the same hierarchy of birth this hour has traced through every other corner of Tudor court life. Anne Boleyn herself followed 2 days later, on the 19th of May, executed by sword rather than axe, a small, specific mercy arranged, it seems, at the King's own direction. 6 people, judged in the space of a single fortnight, on evidence that the passage of nearly 5 centuries has done very little to make more convincing, and Norris, the groom of the Stool, whose closeness to the king had once seemed his greatest protection, was simply one name among that number, no more and no less exposed than any other person unfortunate enough to be standing near the Queen when the king's favour finally, catastrophically, turned. There is a particular, sobering clarity in holding both of these documented fates in mind at once. Compton's fortune and Norris's axe, because they represent, together, the entire range of outcomes this single office actually offered the men who held it. There was no safe middle path available, no quiet, guaranteed retirement waiting at the end of years of loyal service. There was only the wager, renewed each morning behind a locked door, and 2 men's names carved permanently into the historical record, the clearest possible evidence of exactly what that wager could pay out, in either direction, to the men brave or desperate or ambitious enough to accept it. If you picture the reward of this office, you probably picture only its compensations. The land, the income, the closeness to power that so many men at court would have traded almost anything to possess. What that picture leaves out is what the office actually cost the man living inside it, day after day, in ways no land grant could fully repay. Heneage's own body, by 1539, carried the accumulated wear of years spent permanently on call. He rose before the king each morning and frequently could not fully retire until well after the king had gone to bed, because a monarch prone to wakeful nights. As Henry increasingly was in this period, required an attendant capable of responding at any hour, and Heneage's own sleeping arrangements, kept deliberately close to the royal bedchamber, meant that genuine, uninterrupted rest was a luxury his position rarely allowed him. Surviving letters from Heneage across these years mention, in the brief, understated way Tudor correspondence tends to address personal discomfort, his own poor health and exhaustion, complaints folded quietly into the margins of letters otherwise devoted entirely to the king's business, as though his own body's needs were a minor footnote to the far more urgent business of managing someone else's. There was, layered on top of the physical exhaustion, a psychological toll considerably harder to measure, but no less real for its absence from the official record. A man who spends years absorbing another person's private rages, private fears, and private bodily suffering while showing nothing of his own reaction in return, carries a particular kind of strain that the era had no real vocabulary to name, let alone treat. Heneage could not, within the strict etiquette of his position, ever appear rattled by a difficult morning, could never let visible frustration or fatigue colour his service, regardless of how difficult a particular episode of the king's illness or temper had actually been to manage. This constant, practiced composure, maintained across years without any real outlet, is precisely the kind of quiet, unrecorded human cost that the grand portraits and state papers of the era were never designed to capture, because nobody at the time considered a servant's private exhaustion a matter worth writing down. Consider, too, the particular isolation built directly into the structure of this office. Heneage could not fully confide in his own family or his own social circle about the details of his daily work, both because discretion was an absolute condition of his continued employment, and because the sheer strangeness of his actual duties, seriously as they were taken within the palace, would have made for an awkward, faintly absurd subject of conversation anywhere else in English society. He occupied a position simultaneously at the very centre of national power and almost entirely outside the ordinary social world most gentlemen of his rank would have recognized as their own. A man whose closest daily companion, in the most literal sense, was the King of England, and whose actual peers, socially and temperamentally, existed at a permanent, unbridgeable distance from the specific reality of his working life. The broader context here connects to something historians studying the psychology of court service across many different monarchies have long observed. The peculiar burden carried by those whose entire professional value rests on their proximity to a single, unpredictable, and enormously powerful individual. Modern research into caregiving, particularly the sustained, high-stakes caregiving required for a difficult or demanding patient, has repeatedly found that the caregiver's own well-being frequently deteriorates in ways that remain invisible to everyone around them. Precisely because the entire social framework treats the patient's needs as the only needs that matter. Heneage's situation was that same basic dynamic, intensified enormously by stakes that reached, quite literally, into matters of life and death, and by a court culture that offered him status, income and land in exchange for exactly the kind of sustained, self-effacing labor that modern understanding recognizes as deeply exhausting to sustain over years. None of this suggests Heneage was a man to be pitied in any simple sense. He had chosen, or at minimum accepted with open eyes, an office that carried immense risk alongside its immense reward, and by every indication the surviving record offers, he approached that bargain with considerable skill, discretion, and personal discipline. But the portrait of court intimacy this hour has been assembling would be incomplete without acknowledging what that discipline actually cost him. Night after night, year after year. In a body that grew tired in exactly the ordinary ways any human body grows tired under sustained pressure, regardless of how much velvet surrounded the labor or how much gold ultimately compensated it. There is something worth holding on to here before this hour moves toward its final chapters. A recognition that even the men closest to unimaginable power remained, underneath every layer of office and title, simply people managing the particular demands of a difficult job with whatever resilience they could summon each morning. Heneage's exhaustion never appears in any state portrait. It appears only in the margins of his own private letters and in the simple, unavoidable arithmetic of what it actually takes for one human body to remain, for years on end, entirely at the service of another. The office did not begin with Henry VIII, and it did not end with him either, and widening the lens to take in that longer history changes, in its own quiet way. Everything this hour has described so far, because it shows a single strange job surviving, in one form or another, for nearly 400 years after the events this story has been telling. The position was created around 1495 during the reign of Henry VII, the current king's own father, a notably cautious and financially careful monarch who reorganized the private apartments of the royal household into a new arrangement called the Privy Chamber, a space set apart from the more public rooms of the palace and staffed by a small circle of trusted attendants. The very first man to hold the specific office of Groom of the Stool within this new arrangement was Hugh Denis, whose household order for a properly appointed close stool, black velvet fringed with silk, 2 pewter basins, 4 broad yards of tawny cloth, this hour has already described. Denis, like Compton after him, used the office to accumulate genuine wealth and influence, managing significant portions of Henry VII's private finances and establishing, within a single generation, the essential template every subsequent Groom of the Stool would follow. Intimate physical service paired with genuine financial authority, the two woven together so completely that neither could ever really be separated from the other. What changed after Henry VIII's own reign is, in some ways, the most surprising part of this entire story. The office did not fade away as royal households modernized. It persisted under the same name through the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, and under Elizabeth I it transformed into its female equivalent, sometimes called the Chief Lady of the Bedchamber, or, in some records, retaining the older title in its feminine form, staffed by a trusted woman from the Queen's own inner circle who performed an analogous role in service to a female monarch's own private needs. The underlying logic of the position, someone the sovereign trusted absolutely, positioned at the exact intersection of the body's most private demands and the crown's most private business, survived the transition from king to queen essentially unchanged, adapted rather than abandoned. The office continued through the Stuart era, through the Restoration, through the entire long span of the Hanoverian monarchy, gradually shedding the most literal of its original bathroom duties as royal households modernized their private arrangements while retaining, remarkably, both its ceremonial name and a genuine core of intimate trust attached to whoever held it. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the position by then commonly styled Groom of the Stool rather than Stool, a small but telling shift in spelling that distanced the title from its original bodily function while preserving its historic name, had become almost entirely ceremonial, a position of high honor within the royal household typically held by a peer of considerable standing, still carrying real prestige and a real place in the formal hierarchy of court, but no longer requiring anyone to actually attend a monarch's literal toilet. The office finally came to an end in 1901, at the accession of Edward VII, following the long reign of his mother, Queen Victoria. The historical record does not preserve any single dramatic reason for its abolition. No scandal, no crisis, simply the quiet recognition, 4 centuries after Hugh Dennis first assembled that velvet-covered stool for Henry VII, that the office had finally outlived whatever practical or ceremonial purpose it still served in a modern royal household equipped with modern plumbing and modern conventions of privacy. The last man to formally hold the title was James Hamilton, the 2nd Duke of Abercorn, and when Edward VII chose not to fill the position after taking the throne, an office nearly as old as the Tudor dynasty itself simply ceased to exist, closing a chapter of royal service that had opened in a small privy chamber at the very dawn of England's Tudor century. There is something truly striking in holding this entire span of time in view at once. From Hugh Dennis assembling a velvet stool for a cautious, newly crowned Henry VII, through Compton's fortune and Norris's axe and Heneage's careful survival, all the way to a Victorian-era duke quietly relinquishing a title that by then referred to nothing more than ceremonial precedence at court functions. The office outlived the specific danger this hour has spent so much time describing. By the time it finally closed, the mortal stakes that made Norris's fate so genuinely terrifying had long since faded into ceremonial memory, replaced by simple hereditary prestige, a fine old title attached to no meaningful physical duty at all. What began as one of the most intimate and most dangerous jobs in the entire kingdom ended, 400 years later, as little more than a decorative honor, a slow and almost unnoticed transformation that says something quietly important about how institutions built around a single body's private needs can persist for centuries after the original logic that created them has quietly disappeared. It is worth remembering, too, that this same long arc reflects something broader about the whole of English court history. The way real, immediate, physical intimacy with a monarch's body gradually calcified, generation after generation, into pure symbolic status, stripped of both its original function and its original danger. A modern reader encountering the phrase "groom of the stool" for the first time reasonably assumes it must be some kind of joke, an absurd historical footnote invented for a museum plaque or an amusing trivia list. The truth, as this hour has tried to make clear, is considerably more serious than that. A genuine office of state, held by authentically powerful men, carrying genuine mortal risk for those who occupied it during its most dangerous century, and surviving, in diminished and increasingly symbolic form, for nearly 400 years after the particular danger of Henry VIII's own court had passed into history. Picture, for a moment, the full sweep of it. Hugh Dennis in 1497 ordering pewter basins for a new king's private chamber, Compton building a fortune across 2 decades of careful royal favour, Norris on Tower Hill in the May sunshine with almost nothing left to say, Heneage keeping his private weather log in a locked drawer 3 years into a job that had already claimed his predecessor's life, and finally, centuries later, a Victorian duke setting down a title that by then meant honour and nothing more. The stool itself, the actual velvet-covered object at the centre of all of it, is long gone, but the strange, revealing shape of the office it created intimacy as the truest currency of power, remains one of the clearest windows available into how this particular court, and perhaps every court like it, actually worked. There is one further piece of this particular autumn worth telling in its own right, because it shows exactly how these different dimensions of the office, the physical, the financial, the political, and the mortally dangerous, could converge at once around a single piece of business unfolding in the very months this story has been describing. By September of 1539, the same month Heneage was writing to Cromwell about the king's laxative and its successful result. Negotiations were well underway for Henry's fourth marriage to Anne, sister of the Duke of Cleves, a match championed heavily by Cromwell himself as part of a broader diplomatic strategy to secure Protestant alliances on the continent against the threat of a combined Catholic front. Henry had been a widower for 2 years since Jane Seymour's death, and the pressure to secure the royal succession with a second son, insurance against the still real possibility that the infant Prince Edward might not survive to adulthood, weighed on the king in a way that touched every corner of his household, Heneage's daily service very much included. A king anticipating a new marriage, uncertain of a bride he had not yet met, negotiated largely on the strength of a portrait and the reports of ambassadors, carried an entirely different quality of private anxiety than his more visible public confidence ever let on, and Heneage, present for the unguarded hours no ambassador or council meeting ever witnessed, would have observed that anxiety directly, in exactly the kind of daily proximity this hour has already described at length. The marriage negotiations dragged through the final months of 1539, and Anne of Cleves did not actually arrive in England until the very end of December, meeting the king in person for the first time on New Year's Day of 1540, an encounter that history remembers. With considerable specificity, as a genuine disappointment to Henry, who is recorded by multiple contemporary sources as having reacted with visible dismay, famously remarking, according to accounts that reached Cromwell directly, that he liked her not so well as he had been led to expect from her portrait and the reports of those who had negotiated the match. This story is set in the autumn before that particular disappointment, in the weeks when anticipation rather than disappointment still governed the king's private mood, but the broader point holds regardless of exactly which emotional register Heneage was managing on any given morning. The business of a royal marriage, grand as it was and consequential as it was to the wider politics of Europe, still had to pass through the same private rooms and the same intimate daily service this hour has spent so long describing. A king's hopes, his anxieties, his private irritation at delays in the negotiations, all of it surfaced first, if only briefly, in exactly the unguarded hours Heneage alone was positioned to witness, before any of it ever reached the more formal record of council minutes and ambassadorial dispatches. What makes this particular episode worth including here, beyond its simple chronological proximity to the September letter already discussed, is what happened to Cromwell himself in the months that followed. The Cleves marriage, celebrated in January of 1540, proved almost immediately troubled, and by the summer of that same year Henry had begun seeking an annulment, a process that exposed Cromwell, the marriage's principal architect, to exactly the kind of sudden royal displeasure this hour has already shown could prove fatal at this particular court. Cromwell was arrested in June of 1540, stripped of his honours within the same council meeting, and executed on Tower Hill in July, a fall nearly as swift and nearly as total as the one that had claimed Norris 4 years earlier, and one whose roots reached directly back into the diplomatic marriage first being negotiated in the very autumn this story has been telling. Heneage himself survived this particular upheaval, continuing to hold his office through Cromwell's fall and well beyond it, a fact that speaks directly to the careful, deliberately unremarkable approach to court survival this hour has already described. He had served under Wolsey and watched that great minister fall. He would go on to serve alongside Cromwell and watch that minister fall in turn. An entire decade of witnessing the single most powerful men in England rise to dizzying heights and then, with almost no warning, lose everything: their offices, their honours, and in Cromwell's case, their lives, while Heneage himself remained, quietly and consistently, at the king's side through every single one of these upheavals. This was not luck alone, though luck surely played some part in it. It reflected a genuine, hard-won skill at exactly the kind of political invisibility this office demanded of anyone hoping to survive it for more than a few short years. A skill considerably harder to master, as Norris's fate had already proven, than simple competence at the job's more literal duties. The broader pattern connecting all of this deserves to be stated plainly, because it sits at the very centre of what this entire hour has been building toward. The office of Groom of the Stool placed one man, again and again across the whole of Henry's reign, at the exact intersection of the king's most private body and the kingdom's most consequential politics, and the men who held it were required, simultaneously, to manage a monarch's bowels and to survive a court where ministers who had shaped the fate of nations could be arrested, stripped, and executed within a matter of weeks. Heneage's own survival through both Wolsey's fall and Cromwell's fall, bracketing his entire career in this office, stands as perhaps the clearest evidence available of exactly how difficult and exactly how rare that particular combination of skills actually was. Step back now from the individual mornings, the individual letters, the individual men whose names this hour has carried from the close stool to the scaffold, and a handful of larger patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that reach well beyond the specific office of Groom of the Stool and speak to something considerably broader about how power actually functioned inside a court like Henry VIII's. The first pattern concerns the strange, almost paradoxical relationship between physical humility and political weight. Nothing about this office looked, on paper, like a position of genuine consequence. Its formal title referred to bodily waste. Its daily duties involved linen, basins, and the physical management of another man's most private functions, work that a modern reader instinctively files under menial service rather than genuine statecraft. And yet this hour has shown, again and again, that the men holding this office moved money that shaped the kingdom's private finances, held information that foreign ambassadors and English ministers alike considered worth cultivating at real cost, and stood, quite literally, closer to the king's unguarded truth than any duke or bishop in the land. The court's formal hierarchy, all title and precedence and careful seating arrangements, sat directly alongside this quieter, more accurate map of where genuine influence actually lived, and the gap between the two maps is, perhaps, the single clearest lesson this particular office has to offer about how power in this period actually worked. Rank told you where a man stood in a procession. It rarely told you who the king actually trusted with his private mind. The second pattern concerns the specific danger of proximity itself, distinct from any question of competence or loyalty. Norris did not fail at his job. By every surviving account, he performed the intimate, exhausting labour of this office with real skill and real personal devotion across a full decade of service. And his death had nothing to do with any failure in that service. It had to do with the accident of his personal connections at the precise moment those connections became politically toxic. A reminder that at this particular court, closeness to the king carried genuine mortal risk entirely independent of how well a man actually performed his duties. Compton, by contrast, happened to hold the office during a period when the currents of court faction never turned against him directly, and he died wealthy not because he served more skillfully than Norris, but because the specific dangers of his particular moment happened to spare him. The office itself offered no reliable path to safety. It offered only proximity, and proximity, this hour has shown repeatedly, was a wager whose odds no man holding it could ever fully calculate in advance. The third pattern concerns the particular exhaustion of sustained, invisible labour performed in service of someone else's comfort and someone else's power. Heneage's poor sleep, his private complaints folded into the margins of otherwise businesslike letters. His years of practised composure in the face of another man's rages and another man's suffering body. None of this survives in any state portrait or any formal record of the office's duties. It survives only in fragments, and it took genuine effort even for this hour to reconstruct it from the scattered evidence available. This is, perhaps, the least visible of all the patterns this story has traced, and also one of the most universal, because the particular shape of exhausting, self-effacing service to a more powerful person's needs is not, in its essential structure, unique to Tudor court politics. It appears in every century, in every household where one person's comfort depends on another person's sustained, largely unacknowledged labour. And the velvet and the gold surrounding Heneage's version of this labour should not obscure how recognisably human and how recognisably exhausting the underlying pattern actually was. The fourth pattern concerns what this office reveals about the body itself and about a culture's relationship to its own most powerful man's physical vulnerability. Henry VIII was, in every public appearance, gold and velvet and rolling, confident authority, a man the entire machinery of Tudor propaganda worked tirelessly to present as nearly superhuman in his command of his own body and his own kingdom. And yet this same man required daily, intimate assistance with the most basic functions any human body performs, suffered chronic pain from wounds that never properly healed, and depended entirely on medical theories that, serious and intelligent as their application was, rested on a fundamentally mistaken understanding of how the human body actually worked. The court did not resolve this contradiction by pretending the king's body did not exist, the way a modern reader might expect a culture obsessed with royal dignity to behave. It resolved it instead by wrapping that body's every function in velvet and ceremony, treating the king's most private physical needs with the same seriousness and the same elaborate attention it applied to his public appearances. An entire apparatus of dignity constructed not to deny the body's demands, but to absorb them, fully, into the machinery of the state itself. There is a fifth pattern worth naming before this hour turns toward its close, quieter than the other four, but connecting all of them together. Every single dimension of this office, the physical intimacy, the financial authority, the political leverage, the mortal danger, and the exhausting personal cost, flowed from a single underlying fact, that Henry VIII needed, absolutely and unavoidably, one other human being to witness him at his most unguarded, and that whoever occupied that role held something no amount of formal rank could ever fully replicate. This is what made the office simultaneously the most coveted and the most perilous position available to an ambitious man at this particular court, because the very intimacy that made a groom of the stool indispensable also made him, permanently and unavoidably, a man whose entire fortune rested on the continued goodwill of someone whose goodwill, this hour has shown repeatedly, could shift within the space of a single afternoon. Connect all of this back to Heneage himself, standing in that stool room on an ordinary morning in the autumn of 1539, examining a basin with the same careful attention he had brought to the task for 3 years running. He carries, in that single quiet moment, every one of these patterns at once: the physical labour, the financial trust, the political weight, the accumulated exhaustion, and the knowledge, never far from his own mind, of exactly what this same office had already cost the man who held it before him. He is not merely emptying a chamber pot. He is performing, in miniature, the entire strange logic of Tudor power, intimacy converted into influence, influence converted into wealth or danger, depending on the turn of a single unpredictable temperament, and the whole of it resting, every single morning, on nothing more solid than one man's continued ability to read another man's body correctly, and to say, or not say, exactly the right thing about what he found there. Return, now, to the presence chamber at Hampton Court, to the doors swinging open on their great iron hinges, to the King of England walking through them in cloth of gold over crimson velvet, the chain of rubies crossing his chest. The plumed bonnet tilted with a carelessness an hour of careful work produced. You know now what that walk actually cost. and what it actually rested on. You know that less than 2 hours earlier, this same magnificent figure sat on a box covered in black velvet and sheepskin, and that a man named Thomas Heneage knelt beside him, examining the contents of a pewter basin with the trained, careful attention of a physician reading a chart, forming a judgment that would travel within the hour into the private notes of the king's own physicians and, on at least one occasion this very autumn, into a written report addressed to the most powerful minister in England. You know that the warmth of the water poured for that same king, scented with rosewater, was measured with 2 careful fingers before it ever touched his skin, and that the linen wrapped around legs scarred by a jousting accident more than a decade old was warmed by a fire lit for exactly that purpose. Because cold cloth against an open wound was a cruelty this particular household had learned, through long practice, to avoid. You know that the physicians attending this magnificent golden figure believed, with total sincerity and real scholarly seriousness, that the colour and consistency of what Heneage examined each morning offered a genuine window into the balance of blood and phlegm and bile governing the king's entire constitution, and that when the king's digestion failed, as it had failed badly enough in September of this same year to require pills and a blister administered under careful supervision, the resolution of that crisis was worth a formal letter, phrased in the careful vocabulary of the age, describing a very fair siege. You know, too, what this same office had already cost the men who held it before Heneage. You know that William Compton, the king's own boyhood companion, rode this exact proximity to a fortune that made him, by his death in 1528, one of the wealthiest commoners in the whole of England. Land and income and influence accumulated across 2 decades of careful, successful service. And you know that Henry Norris, who followed Compton into this office and held it with what every surviving account describes as genuine skill and genuine personal devotion for a full 10 years, was taken from a jousting tournament in May of 1536, offered a pardon in exchange for a confession he refused to give, and executed on Tower Hill 6 days later. His final recorded words a quiet insistence on a queen's innocence that cost him whatever slim mercy the king's earlier offer might once have represented. 2 men, 1 office, 1 fortune, and 1 axe, and nothing in the daily performance of either man's duties to reliably predict, in advance, which fate a given morning's faithful service was actually building toward. You know that Heneage carried this knowledge with him into every single morning of his own 3 years in the post, that he had watched Wolsey fall before he ever entered royal service, and would watch Cromwell fall the year after this particular autumn. An entire career bracketed by the collapse of the 2 most powerful ministers in England, while he himself remained quietly and deliberately unremarkable at the king's own side through every single one of these upheavals. You know that this survival was not luck alone. It was a skill, hard won and carefully maintained, considerably harder to master than the basin and the linen and the careful reading of a single body's daily condition, though it depended on all of that too, on the accumulated trust that years of exactly this kind of intimate, unglamorous service had earned him. And you know, finally, what none of this cost him in any way the surviving record thought worth preserving in detail, the poor sleep, the private exhaustion folded quietly into the margins of businesslike letters, the years of practiced composure in the face of another man's suffering and another man's rages, a whole private ledger of human cost that the grand portraits, the tapestries, the coins struck with the king's gleaming profile, were never designed to record, because nobody keeping those records considered a servant's own private weariness a matter worth writing down for anyone else to read. Look again now at the king walking into that presence chamber, gold and rubies and rolling confidence, and see him differently than you saw him at the start of this hour. He is not merely a man of immense power, gleaming and untroubled, moving through his palace as though his body answered his every wish without complaint or difficulty. He is a man whose legs pain him badly enough that even a short walk leaves him short of breath, A man whose digestion requires daily monitoring and, on his worst weeks, a treatment that even his own century found difficult to undergo. A man whose private moods are read each morning by a single trusted witness before anyone else in the entire kingdom has any idea what kind of day it is going to be. He is magnificent. He is also, underneath every layer of that magnificence, an aging body in real and worsening distress, managed daily by a small, careful team of people whose own names rarely appear in any account of his reign at all. And see Heneage too, standing just outside the frame of every portrait ever painted of this reign, present in almost none of the official record, and yet present, in the most literal sense imaginable, for more of the king's actual daily life than any minister, any wife, any foreign ambassador ever managed to witness. He is not a comic footnote. The punchline history occasionally reduces him to when his title gets mentioned in passing. He is a highly skilled, carefully disciplined professional, managing simultaneously a medical crisis, a financial portfolio, a political intelligence network, and his own considerable personal danger. All of it performed with hands steady enough that the most temperamental and most powerful man in England trusted him. Absolutely, with every single one of his own private vulnerabilities. There is something worth carrying away from this particular hour that reaches beyond the specific strangeness of velvet stools and pewter basins and Tudor humoral theory. Something that touches on how power itself actually functions in any century behind whatever version of a locked door a given age happens to build. The people closest to power are rarely the ones whose names appear largest in the official record. They are, more often, the ones who managed the unglamorous, unrecorded labor that made the official record's version of events possible at all. The fire lit an hour early, the water tested for warmth, the basin examined with careful attention. The difficult report delivered in exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. History remembers the gold and the velvet. It rarely remembers the hands that made the gold and velvet wearable that particular morning, steady enough, patient enough, and quietly brave enough to hold a position that had already, within living memory, cost one good man his life. Thomas Heneage would go on, in the years following this particular autumn, to serve through the upheaval of the king's fourth marriage and its swift undoing, through Cromwell's fall the following summer, through a fifth marriage and its own catastrophic end, through the long, painful decline of the king's final years, holding this same office for a full decade before finally passing it, in 1546, to another trusted hand, stepping back from the closest possible proximity to the throne of England having survived, across 10 years in the single most dangerous intimate office in the entire kingdom, every single crisis that office could plausibly have destroyed him with. He did what Compton had done. He did not do what Norris had done. And the difference, this hour has tried to show as honestly as the surviving evidence allows, was never simply a matter of skill or virtue, whatever role skill and virtue undoubtedly played. It was, in the end, the same wager every man who ever held this office had accepted the moment he first knelt beside a king's close stool, renewed each morning, settled only when the office finally passed, quietly and without incident, into someone else's steady, careful hands. The candle beside this particular telling has burned low now, the way it always does by the time a story like this one reaches its close. Somewhere beyond the walls of this hour, a palace that no longer stands in the form it took that autumn once held a small, velvet-lined room where a king's most private truth was managed. Morning after morning, by a man whose name most people walking through the ruins of that same palace today have never once heard spoken. He was not a joke. He was not merely the punchline waiting at the end of an unusual historical trivia question. He was a person, careful and exhausted and quietly skilled, holding one of the strangest and most perilous positions his century had to offer, and doing it, morning after morning, with steady hands. Sleep well.